3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Well, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Metaverse Church podcast. And today I'm bringing you a special episode. I got the opportunity to sit down with some friends over at the TheChurch.digital podcast to talk about really church planning and the Metaverse. A guy that has been a huge influential piece in my life for a few years now, by the name of Peyton Jones, was invited to chit chat with me and Jeff Reed over the TheChurch.digital, and really just to talk about all that. And what was amazing about it is we did it on a live Discord recording in our Discord community. And we had some people chiming in some questions and whatnot as we were doing our podcast episode. And right off the bat, somebody throws in the question, how does APEST work for digital metaverse ministry? And if you don't know what APEST is, don't worry about it. We'll dive into it in the podcast. But it was such a sweet, fun conversation that by the time it was all said and done, I had to reach out to Jeffrey. I was like, dude, I need you to send me that file because this needs to be shared on the Metaverse Church podcast as well. So that's what this episode is just me sharing that interview with all of you. You'll also hear at the very end that there's something fun and exciting happening through the Church.digital that I'm a part of. I will be leading a learning community here in the month of June, so right around the corner, all about how to bring your church into the metaverse space. So this is an 8-week long learning community, just one time a week for an hour for 8 weeks, with my promise and guarantee to you, if you're interested in bringing your church into the metaverse, you will know exactly how to do that and be ready for it by the time that 8-week learning community is done. So if that is something that you're interested in, all you have to do is head over to TheChurch.digital /learning-communities, and you can sign up there for it. I'll have the link in the show notes as well. But I would highly encourage you, if you've been interested in listening to this podcast for any length of time and interested in bringing your church or yourself into the metaverse space in order to do ministry, I would love to help you do that. So be sure to hit that link and sign up for it. Okay, that being said, enjoy this episode from the Church.digital podcast with myself, Jeff Reed, and Peyton Jones. Be blessed.
I had the ZZ Top thing, maybe not as bad as Whitebeard. Whitebeard's like 12, 14 inches, literally.
You weren't Stetzer level. Remember when Stetzer, he was out of control?
Yeah. That's a throwback right there, and it was really like he never had the width, like the breadth. It was always kind of like spindly, when he gets long. I'm not calling the man out publicly, but it didn't look good. Like it needed to be kind of thick.
He cut it. He repented of it eventually, but I would love, and I can see with Stunami, he seems like you and I, Stu, like we could be Viking Raiders, right? I feel that.
Yes.
Like, I did find out a year ago I'm directly descended from Ragnar Lothbrok. So this is why I can't have nice things. Yeah, it's definitely, we did that whole thing, where you go back through the records and you find the genealogy, and it went all the way back to Ragnar. So we're like, okay, my brother looks at me and goes, see, this is why we can't have nice things.
Well, I didn't realize until about 5 minutes ago that we're doing this podcast with 3 bald guys with beards and goatees. Like I try not to get myself painted into a corner with different people, and like getting some variety here on the Church.digital podcast. And I've got Mirror Image X3 here as we're talking hopefully about virtual reality and church planting and metaverse and all sorts of interesting stuff. And so. Hey, Peyton, Stu, thanks for jumping on the show here. Neither of you are strangers here to the podcast. Stu, we had on, I don't know, maybe 8 months ago, sometime last summer. And then Peyton, it's been a minute, but we had you on talking plantology, I guess when it first came out a while back. So both of you, thanks for jumping on the show. We are doing this live on Discord, and so we've got Megan, JP, Whitebeard, Alan Frost, and Melanie is in the audience now, and we'll see some others kind of come in and out towards this. But y'all, if you have questions or thoughts, throw it in the chat. Would love to see that and engage. How does a pest model work in VR? My man is Whitebeard is going at it right off, and we
love it.
We've had that conversation, I feel like, in other contexts. I know we've talked about A-Pest in gaming quite a bit. And so that'll be interesting in VR.
Why was I not invited to that one? A-Pest in gaming, let's go.
Yeah, we did that with Mark Lutz. Yeah. So we did a full season last year, I think beginning of last year, January, February, March, on church, video gaming church, talking gaming church pastors, Twitch guys, digital missionaries, people that are actually doing church in the game itself, like in Final Fantasy and Rust and Black Desert. Like it was a pretty deep conversation centered around gaming, and really, if you look at all the different types of digital churches, and there's like 5 or 6 different examples and types, gaming is the fastest growing. And so like the Twitch streamers, they're multiplying quickly. The churches that are operating in that space, they're, coming together and uniting and multiplying. And so, and Mark and Bubba and the Love Thy Nerd crowd and like the crowd that's really working in that gaming space is doing an excellent job of reaching a different type of person. And so really, and Peyton, Stu knows this, Peyton, but like the reason we do virtual reality church and gaming church and social media church and all these churches without buildings, because what we find is that we can reach people that the buildings aren't reaching. We hear stories of like a neo-pagan that finds Christ in virtual reality, or a person that hasn't been to a church building in 10 years finds Jesus through a gaming church. And what's interesting is these people that are finding Jesus in these unique methods, they don't realize there's anything unique about the digital church or the virtual church. It's just church to them, just like any normal expression. And so missionally, like the implications of this thing are huge. And so that's really, I think, hey, Ian, that's some of what I want to get into, hey, Victor, as well, in this conversation. And so, I'm going to ask a lot of questions of both of you guys, and Stu, I'm sure has some questions, and Peyton, hopefully we don't catch you too off guard with some of the Metaverse VR stuff, but would love to get your take and opinion on some of this stuff moving forward.
Yeah, when I don't know something, if you guys don't mind me just saying, hey, I don't even know what that is. That sounds amazing, but tell me more about that. I may need you to educate me on some of it. Okay, so I have said, and you can educate us on this right now. All right, I'm going to throw you a softball to open it up, because I was on a stream telling people about how, we were having this conversation with you, and I was excited about it. And I said, dude's got a freaking Snake Eyes G.I. Joe tattoo on his arm. Okay, right there. Like, I want this to be publicly seen. Lonely Mountain right here with Smaug.
Nice
one.
To educate me with this, because I know it's Snake Eyes, but I'm not deep enough in the G.I. Joe lore to actually know what it is. Like, what is it? Why did Snake Eyes have that on his arm as well?
Yeah, so that's actually Ninja Clan. That's the Ninja Clan tattoo. So he and his brother Storm Shadow, who's part of Cobra, he has it. The Ninja Clan, I'm a serial church planner, and I used to always make the joke that I was a ninja. I don't need any credit. I don't need any glory. I just want to get in and out quickly, strike hard, and disappear back into the shadows. And somebody just started calling me the church planning ninja. I think it might have been Alan Hirsch. And it just kind of stuck. And then I started putting it on my stuff. Alan still calls me Ninja, the Ninja, whenever I talk to him. So, so I got Ninja Clan more just partially because of that, and partially because, there's nothing cooler than ninjas.
I would say pirates, but
Oh, pirates versus ninjas? I don't think so. Like I would take ninjas over pirates.
You can take anything you want. I still choose pirates over ninjas.
All right, I'm going to throw this in chat right now. Pirates over ninjas. Vikings. No, I'm ignoring that one. Yeah,
we need a
Vikings.
poll. When I joined this yesterday, Vikings. There we go. All right,
Pirates. Megan says pirates all the way. Megan, I'm disappointed in you. I was expecting
Thank you, Megan.
Megan was gonna make the decision in my mind, and pirates. Johnny Depp over. Who's a good ninja?
Johnny Depp as a ninja.
Who is there like a? I mean, Johnny Depp is the epitome of pirates. I mean, pirates.
Do you know? There was a special years ago where they said we're gonna get in touch. There's still ninjas out there today, and they said, look, a ninja's going to be able to infiltrate this place. And the guy's like, no way. They had all this security, all this stuff, and the ninja who came in, they're like, there's no way a ninja gets in here, and it was a repair guy. Where he's like, hey, he did something to jam their signal. And then he said, someone called me and said, you guys are having an issue. It was him. It was a repair guy. He got in there and took them all out. And, the point of a ninja is just to be invisible. So we will never be able to name a famous ninja.
It's interesting. Okay. So there is no, which I guess still to me adds the lure of the ninja, but that's okay. We can.
If you know who they are, they failed. If you know who they are, they failed. They failed at their job. They had one job, and that was to stay invisible. And, so you don't get to know who the famous ninja is.
Chris Farley.
By the way, Chris Farley.
Yes.
Chris Farley is a just real quick, Whitebeard throws out the comment, Peyton, I was the guy who knew what movie you were talking about at Exponential, Five Fingers of Death. I don't know what that's referencing.
Yes.
But okay.
All right.
Yeah.
Well done. All right. I remember you, sir. Thank you. You changed my life with that.
Yeah. Once you meet Whitebeard, like he changes everybody's life. Dude, like is crazy. So, all right. Hey, so let's get into this. Enough of ninjas and pirates and Vikings. Let's talk about planting and other crazy ideas. Hey, just to kick us off here a little bit, Peyton, you wrote the book Plantology. I've heard it called the modern textbook of church planting. And, I know friends with Stadia, friends with New Thing, like I've seen it get pushed and promoted and celebrated in many circles. So, man, what was maybe some of your mindset as you were writing the book, Plantology, and maybe you want to give a little description behind it?
Well, the first thing was when Zondervan approached me. I had written a previous book called Reaching the Unreached, Becoming Raiders of the Lost Art. And, when they said, hey, we want you to write a church planting book that will go alongside Keller's book. That's why it's the same size, yada, yada. It is nowhere near worthy to sit alongside Center Church, but that was their idea. We need a nuts and bolts book on church planting. And I said, no, I'm not. No. And they're like, why? You're like, you run the pod. At that time, I'd quit the podcast. And I said, yeah, I don't know if I believe in church planting in America anymore. And they said, why? And I said, well, let me tell you two things. If I write a book on church planting, it's going to piss everyone off right away. And number two, it's going to probably not sell very well. We'll end up selling, like becoming a number one bestseller, like almost overnight, like in pre-launch. And Zondervan's like, this has already outsold all of our church planting books. So it somehow resonated with people. But the first thing it does is it tells you most of what you've heard of as church planting is church starting, right? Get a butt ton of cash, attain critical mass, rent out a building, do a bunch of marketing. That's church starting. And the apostles didn't know how to do that. But we also don't know how to do what the apostles did. So what if we could go back and relearn timeless principles, things that could be applied anywhere, anytime, with anyone, which, hello, digital church, digital church planting. there we go. If we can find a universal principle, then it doesn't matter. I call it the Dr. Seuss philosophy of church planting. On a train in the rain, in a box with a fox, right? I can plant them, Sam, I am. Because these timeless principles are laid down in the New Testament. They're globally out in the world working today. And in periods of church history where you see kingdom advancement, these same principles are found, like in the Wesleyans, the Moravians, the Korean church, Azusa Street revival. You can go and find these same principles at work. And so that was the mindset. But I figured if I'm going to do one thing, I'm either going to change the conversation or I'm going to kill my writing career.
Well, either way, it's a win, right? Because either this thing's going to blow up. Was it saying "go big or go home"? Right? And so, you went radical. You wrote from the heart, and it responded in a big way. I loved. I read it a couple of years ago when we did the podcast first time around, and enjoyed it thoroughly, and even seeing how it was impacting Tsunami with him just in recent weeks as he was diving into it. Stu, as you were reading it, I know like a lot of people know Stuart's passion is to, he's a pastor at Vector Church, which is a virtual reality church plant. He also works with a physical church that's doing virtual reality, but he's planting one from scratch as well. And his heart's to see 100 churches in virtual reality in the next 10 years and wants to actively help churches get into this. And we'll talk about more about that here in a little bit. But, Stu, as you're reading the book and getting into some of this, like, what are you seeing in context of virtual reality planting? Like, how would some of these ideas that Peyton's talking about, how would it apply over into the virtual space?
I think what really interests me and intrigues me about what Peyton is writing, and so I'm coming into plantology after reading Reaching the Unreached, right? So I'm reading those two back to back on each other right now. And so what was getting me in both books so far is just that concept of church starting versus church planting. I think one of the stories that really stood out to me that you wrote in the first one, Reaching the Unreached, was just the idea of you doing a book club in Starbucks. And the next thing you know, you've got this church that is all of a sudden going, right? Yeah. And so within virtual reality, the thing that has stood out to me is the majority of people in virtual reality are either hostile to the name of Jesus or they've never heard the name of Jesus before. And so you're bringing somebody in who's got an apostolic evangelistical bend to their nature, right? And just saying, here's a space where I can make Jesus famous to the best of my ability, and I'm going to win kingdom territory here. And for me, the beauty of it is this small gathering of people that maybe for the first time ever, they're hearing the truth of the good news of Jesus, or they're hearing the name of Jesus for the first time. And because it's internet-based globally, all of a sudden, here's this light and the seeds of hope that are being presented to people, maybe for the first time. They're then going back into their own physical context that has the potential to change the world and that essence. So that, to me, for what is happening in virtual reality and what I see for the church in virtual reality, the capital C global church, is just that concept of like, dude, we can start churches left and right, and I'm all for that. But the concept of actually reaching the lost and the hard to reach places. Yes, man, VR and digital spaces, they provide probably the fastest highway avenue in order to do that. In fact, I've told people, it's like you have Jesus who says to this small band of believers, go into the world and make disciples, right? But now in our digital age, here's the world funneling themselves down to small bands of believers that then goes back out into the world. It's this really cool system that when I look at it, I think of it through church history and historical concepts, right? Of just this idea of, here comes the Greeks bringing in a common language. Here comes the Romans bringing in a highway system in order for everybody to hear and know the good news as quickly as possible. And the internet's doing the same thing, especially within VR. So, yeah. Yeah, 100%. I think, and it took me, I'll be honest, like it took me a minute to get digital church. At first, I'm like, no, because the missional movement so emphasized the incarnational nature of ministry that I had this mental block. And then I was having a conversation with Chesley Lundy
and he just mentioned to me, hey, you're apostolic. This should click for you, Peyton. Couldn't you, you start communities, right? Like that's the apostolic thing. You have the ability to start communities. If there's an iron curtain between church and unchurch, the apostolic lives on that unchurch. You'll often hear an apostolic minister say, I have more in common and have better conversations with people who don't even believe in God than I do at a pastor's conference. That's how you've just told me you're apostolic without telling me you're apostolic, because you're wired for out there. So to me, this VR, the digital space, this is the apostolic frontier of today. Paul would be here. First thing Paul did is he went to where the people are at. That's like the first thing we got to know about apostolic ministry. You go to the marketplace. You go where the people are at. You don't sit in an upper room forever. You don't just meet house to house. You get out in the temple courts. Temple courts now is digital. So you've got to get out there. So sorry, I know I'm going to keep my answer short because I know we got a lot of questions. But that to me was a breakthrough for me. And to go a little bit into Whitebeard's question, the biggest mistake our movements always make is that whenever we get a hold of something, we make it all that. So for example, Calvary Chapel, if those of you that saw the Jesus Revolution, I grew up in Calvary, not grew up, but when I got saved, 15 years old, for a number of years, became a pastor there, on and on. You have in that movie, what was brilliantly portrayed was you had an apostolic, Lonnie Frisbee, a teacher, Chuck Smith, and an evangelist, Greg Laurie. Three of them together, and you see this explosive growth that comes out. That's what God wired the early church for. That's why they saw what they saw. But eventually, and the prophetic started to rise up, but that quickly got squelched. So then that became Vineyard. So all meant to be together. Think of the power of these five dynamics all in one space. But it became a teacher movement. Vineyard. And sorry, I'm going to step on all 10 toes, or at least 5 of your toes on one foot, because nobody, like all movements, have usually gravitated towards one aspect of the APEST. So for example, the prophetic leaders are over in Pentecostal Charismatic. And I love Pentecostal Charismatics, right? For all the power and presence of God they bring. But when you leave people alone on their own too long, they start to distort what Jesus looks like. Teachers, if you leave a teacher alone too long, if you leave an evangelist, I would say Mark Driscoll was an evangelist. And if he's not left alone too long, it's fine. He brings something fresh and dynamic. And then if you leave him alone, it begins to distort, because here's the reality. The 5 need each other for balance. And in church plantology, I talk about if you put the apostolic and prophetic together, you got a power team. Put the shepherd and teacher together, you got a power team. The middle is the evangelist. We won't stick up the middle finger. He brings the message of offense, the gospel. But I do this 5 fingers of death, thank you, Whitebeard, illustration where I talk about all fingers. You would never fight someone with your finger unless you were in that movie, 5 Fingers of Death. He had a kung fu finger. But when you bring all 5 fingers together, you make a weapon that has kingdom impact, packs a punch. So when you've got the apostle brings them all together for planting. So this is my point. Getting to the punchline now. The biggest mistake we're going to make, in just like missional community was, I would say, a shepherd movement. Let's do life on life. Let's get together. Let's have dinner. Even though it seemed apostolic, it actually ran into the rut of it became a shepherding movement, and everybody got stuck, and they just threw the best home studies the world had ever seen, but it got stuck because the APEST, for the kingdom of God to advance, we have to work together. We get stuck when we don't work together. So what will happen in the digital space if we don't address what Whitebeard brought up? How does the APEST work? It's going to be Like I would call Mark Driscoll evangelist Ron Wild, right? Like leave him to the, in my defense, I was left unattended. John MacArthur, teacher, left to himself too long, right? You get stale and stagnant and, so it all starts to distort. We know Jesus doesn't look like that. Sorry, I'm going to offend people on your call, but the reality is you bring them all together. There's this freshness. That's what the early church had. The apest, read Acts 2:42. It's all in there. Right? With the golden age of the church, it's all represented. But our danger in this apostolic frontier will be to leave it to the apostles only. And then it will start to lose its bearing. But if we can bring the other four into this movement, it will become something very beautiful and very needed. And it may actually, this would be my challenge to people in your space. I believe the greatest hope for seeing all five work together is in your camp. It is the digital space camp. I actually think this may be the one place people can truly find it if it's stewarded well.
By the way, I winced at the John MacArthur, not because you're offending me or probably anybody else on this call. John MacArthur is no friend of the Church.digital. Has actually called us out publicly. Actually, it was at Chesley. He mentioned Chesley by name about in a blog about the idea of he was so offended by the virtual church. When he said virtual, he meant digital, but it's some stale language. I think stale's a good word there. So, and honestly, it's interesting looking on this call. Whitebeard does street ministry in Art District in Tampa, Ybor City. Justin Nava is a digital micro church. Ian is a very small church up in the Pacific Northwest. Melanie and Sumi Beats are a digital micro church that meets on Zoom. Megan's at probably a borderline mega church that's doing digital incredibly. Victor's in Africa. And so like you've got a very eclectic mixed bag of people literally on this call that are just listening in. But what's really interesting to me is when you talk about like starting church and you're talking about the APEST is so necessary and going to where the people are and the digital marketplace and all of this. Yet the idea of a micro church still gets heat, maybe a little more accepted, but the average church, they're actually viewing that as like the disenfranchised,
for people who can't
angry
plant
people.
Real churches, yeah,
exactly, yeah. It's like the people that don't want to do real church or
right.
The digital. It's like you guys are just lazy people sitting at home. Virtual reality, there's only 22 million people using virtual reality actively every month. Who cares about them? Go to a building, and so like it's interesting to me how there's so much animosity towards more of the fringes. Whereas, I don't know, I see God moving in the fringes. Like biblically, he is not still. He's constantly moving. And so, I don't know, like what's your take on maybe some of I'm using the MacArthur word intentionally, the staleness that when we see with starting churches or legacy churches compared to experimenting and doing something for the kingdom?
Couple of things. Number one, you mentioned God being on the fringe. And he is. The kingdom of God always outpaces the church. And I mentioned this in that chapter in Plantology on culture, because if you look, like Martin Luther King Jr. wrote that letter from a Birmingham jail. And in that, he's asking the white church leaders in Birmingham, Alabama, where are you? I'm in jail. Like, I need you in this fight with me. And he very succinctly points out that the kingdom of God is always ahead of the established church. So God is out there moving beyond the boundaries of where the church is. Churches are always catching up to the kingdom. If your theology tells you the kingdom and the church are the same, you haven't been paying attention. Yes, the kingdom of God is the church, but the kingdom, if you look at Jesus, the kingdom is wherever the king is. God beat us to the digital space. He was the first person there, right? Satan might have been the second one there, but God was the first, right? God was the first one there. He always goes ahead of us. And the more frontline ministry you do, kind of like Whitebeard, like I'm sure he's got a million stories of where God was already moving in this person's life. I'll never forget showing up at a house where there was one of my neighbors, and I felt the presence of God in her living room. Now, she was drunk and her husband was stoned the first time I ever met him, because we invited him to a barbecue, and they got in this huge fight and stormed off. And, we could hear him yelling as they walked down the road to their house. And we thought, oh, well, it was awkward. We'll never see them again. And then we called into their house, and I was hit by this wall of God. And as a missionary this is Wales, UK, where I was for 12 years. I remember just being scandalized. Like, I'm the missionary. I bring this, like, well, what's wrong with this picture? And God was saying, you're always late to the party. Have you not figured that out yet? I've been working in these people's lives way before you. Come on, big britches, like you're a little too big for yourself right now. You don't bring this. I bring this, and you show up afterwards. I go before you. I come along behind you. And those are just lessons that you got to learn early on in ministry. And that's definitely been the case here. But going back to the idea of the APEST, it's really interesting because these ministries, what happened for a number of years was the shepherd and teacher, and I would say particularly the teacher, was in vogue. And the evangelist still, nobody could work with it. Like, no church hires an evangelist, right? I'm sure Whitebeard, they might say, if you have a church supporting you, Whitebeard, forgive me for this, but probably what they do is they oh yeah, go do that out there, right? Evangelists will come in and they will wreck everything in a good way, but they're going to wreck it. So just get ready, right? Like I used to have a guy, he'd lead people on the streets to Christ every day. And every other pastor would be like, man, I give my left arm to have that guy, but how do you pastor him? Because every week he'd be out in the parking lot, Jonesy, you reach the lost, or I will, right? Like, he was taking no prisoners. He wasn't holding back, right? They're a live wire. And most pastors, like, we just, it's kind of like Radiohead. No alarms and no surprises, please. We want things nice and calm here. That's what we do. But here's one thing to know. In the same way that the teacher shepherd were reigning supreme for years and years and years in the church, and there was no place for the apes, it's starting to swing, at least in missional movement and, some of the spaces that you're in and I'm in. The shepherd and teacher are not in vogue anymore. And so we have to be aware of that, because that's going to come back and bite us if we allow what's trendy or popular to rule and reign. Now, thank God, in that APEST division, there's a ratio of 3-2. Your radicals are your apostles, prophets, evangelists. Your conservatives are your shepherds, teachers. The shepherds, teachers have been running the show for the last 100 years. But now, if we start letting the apes run, that will lead to a lot of kingdom advancement. But in the book of Acts, after chronicling the activity of the apes, Acts is broken up by quality metrics. And there's actually quantitative metrics, but they're put in shepherd and teacher terms. And the word of God spread, and the number of disciples grew. So there's your shepherd teacher. They're not really mentioned very much at all during the whole thing. But when Luke wants to say, right, there was success, the Marines did their thing, the Army rolled in and held the fort down. So we need both. So what's going to happen with digital space is if we don't, if we think, oh, teacher shepherds, that's not very sexy anymore, then, and we ignore them and don't let them come to the fore, then our movement will not be sustainable. It will be flash in the pan, but it will not have that sustainability metric.
So I wrote up maybe 15 questions we were going to get into. I don't think I've touched one question on this.
Sorry.
And no, I may not even go there, because when I sat down, I was not thinking we'd cover APEST, and this is just fascinating. And so now you said the word, and I want to hit both of you on this, because both of you get your fingernails hopefully dirty on this or have lived in this world. You said the word incarnate. you were uncomfortable, Peyton. You were uncomfortable with this because of, the micro church. I hear it all the time. Incarnate, being with someone is just so important. And Jeff, you just don't get that digital. To be honest, like the Church Digital, we really operate, and we try to operate like in a micro church strategy, but just in digital and virtual space. Like that's really how we try to encourage our ministry to grow. And a lot of our micro church brothers and sisters, to be honest, some of them are not friends. Like they don't see what we're doing, and they've got issues with that idea. And so Peyton, you saw the light. You had a conversation with Chesley. Stu, you used to mock virtual reality churches. You're like the Saul in this conversation, leading to the conversion one day of Paul. Like, I would love to hear from both of you how you got over, like, what was it internally that you had to reconcile to see a little bit of the story, a little bit of the theology, like whatever it is, like what helped you see the light, so to speak, or change your mind?
For me, obviously, it was just COVID. I mean, prior to COVID, an article comes out on VR Church, and I thought that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard of in my life. I was probably the loudest voice in the room. Got over here to Lakeland during the height of COVID and quickly heard that they were wanting to explore this idea of virtual reality church. And I was like, cool, you guys hired me to be a small group pastor, so I don't have to worry about it. I was like, I'm more than willing to focus on building small, like digital small groups. Because of COVID, I saw the need for it. So I was ready to go head first into that, but still VR idea was still like way out of my league and something I still struggled with, but I got the invite into it, right? So the idea was, let's start a church in virtual reality. Let's bring Lakeland into it. And if we get nothing more than a small group out of it after a 6-month trial, we'll call that good. And, 3 years later, here I still am as full-time VR campus pastor. And really for me, what it was is just, I was seeing people, to Peyton's point, this is hardcore apes coming out, right? For sure. But I was seeing people be introduced to Jesus, and I was seeing connection on a whole different level than what I see in person. And what I mean by that is I saw people getting really authentic and transparent right from the beginning because nobody's trying to save face. So here we are as this church in virtual reality, and people think that it's a joke. So they're showing up, or they're coming in to just completely trash the environment and the experience. But what they're coming in with is all these questions and biases and baggage. And they're going, so are you actually a church? Are you actually a pastor in this space? I'm like, yeah. And they're fine. And they're like, here it is. Here's all the stuff that I'm carrying right now. Now fix it. And I'm sitting there going, I can. I know who can. So if you're willing to go on this journey with me to understand who Jesus is, I can almost guarantee that he'll make himself known to you. He's not an unknown God. And so for me, that's where it really started to unravel. Like I liken it to the confessional box for Catholics, right? It's like, here I come, here's all my baggage. I can't see you, you can't see me. The avatars act as that confessional screen in between, where people are just way more authentic and transparent with their struggles and their questions than we get in real life. What is fascinating to me, though, and a lot of pushback that I still get from people is, it's not real. People can show up, they can not be involved, they can just stand to the side, they can blip in for a second and blip out. And I always go back to the idea, it's like, how many first-time visitors or second or third or year-long visitors do you have showing up to your physical church that they are coming in late, sitting in the back, and the first ones to leave because they're not wanting to be known or seen that they're there? It's just the same. We're just finding new areas to live that out. But I mean, many of us get called into ministry because God has given us a heart for people. and we want those people to be introduced to Jesus, and we want to teach Jesus in the process. Like, we want to preach the gospel. And sometimes we can do it in physical spaces where it's the same people showing up week after week, and they're hearing the same message week after week. But in the VR space, I was like, dude, you're putting me in the middle of people who they've never heard this before. It's like, this is fun. Like, this is smack dab in the middle of like who Jesus and the early apostles and disciples were reaching. Like, this is completely different and a lot of fun. So the question for me became, how do we become the street corner church in the VR spaces? And that's what we ended up chasing after.
Beautiful. I want to get to the missional implications here with the next question, but Peyton, Incarnate, like how did you talk to me about some of your mindset of how you pivoted, and maybe help us as we're trying to figure out how to converse with our church leaders and things like that. How can we help them maybe understand a different viewpoint?
Yeah. So this is going to be an incomplete analogy, but I see it a little bit like Wesley and Whitefield when the church was stuck, and the Anglican church wasn't bad in its time, but it was stuck. I think we have to look back, and Anglican church had a lot of strengths at that time. A lot of times we can read the narrative that the Anglican church sucked, therefore, but Wesley died an Anglican, and he wasn't trying to replace the Sunday service. He was trying to reach more people. So what he did is he went out to the highways and byways and he preached in the marketplace. That's our digital space, our catch-all. Then he created the bands, which did not replace a Sunday gathering, but it fostered life change and discipleship groups. Like what people would call microchurch now was bands. And it's the reason things exploded. So when we go back to the church plantology principle, did these things work in the early church? I can point to what I just described in the book of Acts easily in multiple places. Then I can go to globally, where does this still happen? And then I can go to church history, which I let out with. So there are timeless principles here. The problem that people really getting hung up on is the technology. And, one of the things, there's a couple things I'll say about technology and mission. Number one, the golden age of Israel was when David came back from the Philistines. The reason the Philistines dominated the Jews was because the Philistines were an Iron Age people. The Jews were a Bronze Age people. David brought back Iron Age technology, right? From having been a mercenary in their armies. When he brings that back to Israel, they become the golden age. Now, the question is, was it wholly due to iron, or was it due to the Lord, or was it due to both? I would argue it was probably both, that the Lord moved through that technology and the Israelites whooped up with the Spirit of the Lord. David was a man of battle. He clearly knew. You came down, Lord, where we get Ephesians 4, 10, and 11 from, Psalm 68. You came down onto the battlefield and you ascended back up into heaven, giving gifts and leading captives. And like David felt God came down and fought. So it was supernatural, but he also had iron in his fist. So then when we go to the modern mission movement, happened because of William Carey, yes. But it really hit full steam, no pun intended, with the advent of the steam engine, because now you could get all over the world quicker. So now we had this explosion of the modern mission movement with the advent of the steam engine. Now we're entering into a new time. It's not the Gutenberg press, but it's literally a new part of technology. A few years from now, we're going to be doing this in virtual. People don't realize it yet, but virtual, everything is going towards virtual. There seems to have been some kind of effort to tamp that down. Maybe that's an investor ploy. Who knows what that is? I'm not wearing a tinfoil hat, but it is in a big way going to sneak up on all of us, just like the iPhone, just like that revolution happened. We all wish we'd been in on the ground floor. This is what's going to happen. Right now, people are pretending like it was just flash and pan. We tried it, didn't work. It is going there. And as we get ready for that to happen, I guess the question that you asked, to go back to that, it's my Wesleyan roots, because I'm a Free Methodist these days. So to me, I keep looking at John Wesley going, oh my gosh, he figured this stuff out hundreds of years ago. And that's what we're looking at, is that wide gathering catchment space, the bands that brings them together for meaningful conversations and discipleship, and then gathering. So if you look at plantology, as opposed to church starting, the 3-step process of the apostles was sow the seeds of the gospel. That's that wide catchment space. Water through discipleship. That's your bands. That's those little communities Stu's talking about. And then the last part, which is the incarnational part, that's your 3rd stop. I'm a hybrid. I believe that the goal will ultimately be to get people face to face. It may not, and I don't think it's right to say if we can't get there, it's not worth it, because right now I'm training in 72 countries. I can't travel very much. I've got a special needs daughter, but thanks to Zoom, I'm catalyzing Ephesus training hubs all over the world right now. I thank God for this technology.
Incredible. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, even segueing to the next question. 72 countries is incredible. I didn't realize with you, Peyton, but we've got Inyi Chukwu on the call now. He came in. He's in Nigeria. He actually works with the navigators in Nigeria. And so
I love the navigators.
Oh, yeah, it's great. And so he's like asking questions about digital evangelism and how to really be effective utilizing digital to reach that person that is cold to Christ. And Stu, like you mentioned that a lot, and you're Peyton, you're talking about Wesley, and there's so much potential in digital and meta as we're looking at what like the role of in the future of evangelism, future of outreach, and what are these things going to look like. Would love maybe just to hear from both of you, like what are some wins, what are some opportunities, what are some steps maybe that we can be taking now as we're looking at what the future and maybe reaching people utilizing this metaverse and virtual reality technology. Stu, maybe you want to share a little bit of some of the stuff you've been doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's still all so new, right? Like here I am sitting in the seat for 3 years, and I feel like every single week I'm having to make subtle adjustments or big adjustments in order to really speak a language or a love language to the people that I'm coming across. I think, the common misconception and what a lot of people will ask for, like if you're a church leader, be like, well, how do I do what we're doing physically into the VR digital space? And most times I argue like, you can, I don't know that I would. When I started Vector earlier this year, I walked into it with this mentality of like, okay, we're going to do one worship song that we brought in from YouTube. And then I was going to teach a 20, 30 minute message and then close out. So pretty much what you would experience at, your local church. And I think I did it for maybe 2-3 weeks. I was like, dude, this just is not cutting it. Like people have questions. They would much rather get in conversation, which like when the service was done, I would leave the event open just to fellowship and hang out with people, and people were asking questions. And that's probably like the most fruitful, beneficial time of this VR service I was putting on. So about a month into it, I just told everybody like, we're scrapping what this originally looked like, and we're going a completely different direction. I told them, I was like, I want to keep the worship aspect of it. I think it's a great way to set the table. But you guys have questions. So you bring me your questions. I will research, and then I'm going to come back with questions, and we'll chase after it together. And then I'll throw the cherry on top of here's the scriptural point of view on what it is that we were chasing after. So what I'm experiencing is like there is such a huge, like people acknowledge that there's a void in their life, and people acknowledge that the world just doesn't seem like it's very much in control right now. And so they want to know, why is the world the way it is? Why is there so much disaster? Why can I see a church in virtual reality and expect them to tell me that there's something good in a not so good world? And I'm sitting there going, okay, like let's dive into these hard topics that you might not experience on a Sunday in your local church context, because they're chasing after their own series. So it's felt-based needs. And then on top of that, the people who are coming in with me, like they're starting to hear these questions, like the hard questions, and they're learning firsthand how to address those questions. So then they're going back to their own friends and their own neighbors and their own family members incarnate and answering those questions and then leading them to Jesus at the same time. So I'm seeing like this evangelistic muscle that's all of a sudden being flexed and strengthened that hasn't been there for quite some time. To Peyton's point, a shepherd teacher movement. And I think that's what people have been hungry for. I think you've got people outside of the church that have been hungry for the church to be the church. And then I think you got people inside of the church that have been hungry for the church to be the church and be kingdom advancers. So yeah, I think that there's just tons of different opportunity. It just really boils down to, what do you want to do as a church? What do you want to do as a person? And more importantly, like, what is God calling you to do in that space? And why wouldn't you just do it? It's so easily accessible to you to just get going.
It's beautiful. Peyton, as we pivot to you, I want to do an add-on here, because I know your time is rare. We may continue the conversation on our side a little bit here once you leave. But as you're talking about, opportunities for evangelism in virtual meta space, you're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, which is so appropriate. Maybe some advice to somebody that's wanting to plant a church in virtual reality. What would be some takeaways or advice that you would give to someone with that? So let you take it from there.
Yeah. I was going to say one of the kind of cool things, I'll answer the first part first and then the second part. The digital thing for us, the opportunity that it's really given us is, let's put it this way. We started training people. I used to have to be physically on the ground and train people physically. And so the way our churches that we planted would multiply, and we discovered microchurch, because you're always going to discover, much like what Stu said, I discovered all this interactive stuff. We never sat in rows, because the first church that I planted, accidentally, I might add, was in a Starbucks around discussion with Dan Brown Da Vinci Code. 30 Europeans turned up first week, 40 second week, 50 third week. And they just wanted to read the real Gospels after the first couple weeks. And so that became a church. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, medium has always been an issue, right? The reason I was talking that technology, C.S. Lewis took to the radio. I mean, that was him, World War II, using the technology available to him. We got Mere Christianity out of that. Because that was a radio broadcast to start, because the church medium was not what he needed. Tim Keller, right, doing the New York Times, right, and that would have been digital, right? We're not talking people getting literal newspapers; they're getting emails into their inbox. Tim Keller harnesses that. So I think for us, we're training. We've been training. Over the last few years, just church plantology came out of that, but I've been training on the ground and been so limited, and we're getting ready to unleash all of our training for free to everybody, because we've been doing this for the global world, and we try to keep the light switched on, but we're like, this whole thing is about faith. Let's just flick a switch. It's for what people can afford. If they want to give, pay it forward to the next person, but we're not going to charge. So we've tried the last 6 months just charging. We made some money. It was great, but we just don't feel right about it. And where we're headed, we need to reach the next gen. Like, the next gen is my big thing. Like, when you're talking about opportunities. So this is the reason. I was in a think tank recently for denominations, and we did a bunch of Post-it notes. Everybody, they broke us up into groups, and all these different groups put on the walls, what are the top 20 things that you think we need to do to get the church unstuck? So here's all these denominational leaders. And someone in one of the groups had written youth. And my wife and I were there together, and they told us, you can circle on all these Post-its, probably, 120, 140 different things represented here. Circle the top 3 you think we ought to focus on. And my wife circled youth 3 times. And she said, because if we don't focus on that, nothing else we do matters.
Yeah.
So the young people are here now. I'm not a young person. I'm never going to be cool on TikTok. But if I can be a Paul to their Timothy, if I can be a Yoda to Obi-Wans that are training Luke's, I've done something. I've really done something. So I think, I'm the reason I have to jump is I'm getting ready to hop on to a webinar with Ralph Moore, who's recently come on with us, and he's brought all of his training to us for free. And so all of our training is going free. Here's a guy that through discipleship, 2,700 churches came out of it, just through discipling people. He had it all. He had the ring of power. He had the big stuff, and he just gave it away and said, you know what, I just want to make disciples. And I think if I were to, my next book will be called Discipology. And the way that we took apart the book of Acts to explore church planning, we're taking apart the gospel to look at disciple making. And I am just blown away by the intentionality of Jesus. There's a pattern there. There's things he did that nobody's talking about. And I just cannot wait to unpack that. That's actually my biggest motivation for just flicking that switch and saying, literally, I want every youth group to be taking this training. I want to release. There are 4 things Jesus trained the 12 to do in those 3 years: to become disciples, make disciples, gather and scatter disciples. By the way, gathering and scattering, that's microchurch. So anyways, guys, thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. And thanks for asking about the book. Hopefully, those of you that are on here, they're like, hey, I'm never going to be a church planner. Hopefully, Discipology will really, really appeal to you.
I know. I love it. Thank you for jumping on this. Anytime I have a conversation about APEST, I'm giving you a call. It was funny. I was actually trying to find a resident APEST expert to pull into a podcast or two. And Peyton, you're now going to be my guy. Thank you for contributing to this.
Happy to.
And we'll let you head off to the webinar, say hi to Ralph, and thanks for coming on. Hey, we're going to stick around and keep doing this interview. Peyton, thank you very much. By the way, there was a question in Ms. V. Read a book by Neil Cole called Church 2.0. I've done a podcast with Neil. Church 2.0 was actually very influential. Peyton would say the same thing. But Neil tells actually a really interesting story in the book about church in a coffee shop. They were actually in the process of starting a coffee shop and to do church in. And then they realized we don't need to buy a coffee shop. We can just do church in a coffee shop. And so they actually pivoted that way to do that. Here's the question I want to ask you as you're wrapping up, Stu. As you're looking at, because you're running a Vector, which is a plant, and you're running a physical virtual through Lakeland. What's a way that virtual reality can complement a physical church? Is there a way that the two can work together? That have you seen or what do you model through some of the things that you're doing?
Yes, 100%. The real question is, what does that physical church want to do, and what do they want to use virtual reality for? If you're wanting to broadcast what Lakeland does as a video venue, multi-site campus, you can do that. And there's tons of different platforms, not tons. There's 2 main platforms I can think of off the top of my head that you can do that. But as I've been picking apart this more and more, it really boils down to just that question of what is it that you want to accomplish? Do you want your people in your church to be stronger evangelists? There's a use for that. Do you want to make the Bible come alive to people at your church and to people in virtual reality? There's a way to do that through world building, which I would say, even to the point that you were just saying with Church 2.0 and Neil Cole, it was the same thing for us. When we launched into it, we used what was already there, and then we decided to pay for somebody to build a world for us in Altspace. Altspace shut down, and now we're in big screen, and we're just, again, using what's already there. And it's just look, people are going to show up to it. We don't have to do anything fancy. It's the beauty of the gospel. It's simple. Just show up someplace and start preaching it and let people know that there's a God who is for them and not against them. And there you go. You've got something really amazing happening. But really, the beauty of what VR does for the physical church is anything that you dream up, you can do. And so it's just like, this is where your creatives come into place. This is where your trailblazers and your futuristic minded individuals come into place. And you just say, dude, run wild. Like my XP here at Lakeland, he was telling me not too long ago that there's a whole team. I guess this would be the Disney Imagineers or whatever they're called, but like that's their job, is they just sit there and they dream up the new things that they could do for Disney and movies and whatever else. And like, dude, if you have somebody on your team that can live in that headspace, like that's me, right? Like I'm that dreamer. I'm always thinking of like, what's the next thing that we can do? I'm a great starter, not a great finisher. I'll be the first one to admit that. But I'm also really good. Like that APEST mentality that Peyton was talking about. Like you really got to have all five if you're going to pack a punch. Like I love that. I'm going to do this from now on. But like even for like VR space, like that's what you need in there, is you need all five of those in order to do it well. And I've acknowledged that for myself, is like, dude, I know that I'm a great starter, but I need the other people around me to make the nuts and bolts come together in order for that dream and that vision to come to life. So anything that the physical church can dream up and wants to do, you can do it in the virtual space. And that can be strengthening what you already have, broadcasting what you have, or taking over new territory that hasn't even been thought of yet. So
I love that. By the way, my daughter's goal in life is to become a Disney Imagineer. I'm not kidding. That's like the thing she's striving for. She wants to get her degree from MIT and then go get a job with Disney. So anyway, another conversation for a different day. Hey, so good. So we are, and we've talked about this through past couple podcasts in this season. We're doing a series of learning communities here with the Church Digital, and one of them is going to be virtual reality. Where Stuart's leading a number of churches to start a ministry in virtual reality, whether it's a church, whether it's a small group, whether it's whatever. But it's more than just exploring. Like we want to actually help churches get dirty and really start to understand and do what ministry looks like in virtual reality. And so, Stu, do you maybe want to share a little bit about what your learning community is going to look like?
Yeah. So just, 45 minutes, hour long learning community once a week for about 8 weeks. And really it's just going to be the nuts and bolts of what it would look like to get started in virtual reality and kicking Satan's butt and spreading Jesus' name. And so we'll just go through like the nuts and bolts of it. Like, what is VR? Like, man, is this even a place that the church is supposed to be in at this point? We'll talk about what are the different platforms out there. DJ Soto and I hopped on a call 3 years ago when I was first getting started. And he was just like, dude, you got to look at each of the platforms as like different countries around the world. So, like, your big screen is going to be like your United States, North America, and then your VR chat is going to be your Middle East. I did that on purpose, by the way. And then, so on and so forth. So each one has its own language. Each one speaks differently. It's got its own different culture people. So it's understanding like, man, who are you geared towards? Like I personally, I'm not a VR chat person. I would love to be, but it's just not who I am. This is why big screen works really well for me. Like the small knit community, like let's get into really good conversation. But we'll go through all that kind of stuff. And then my guarantee is as long as you've got a headset, by the time that 8 weeks is done, you'll be full on ready to be in virtual reality and kicking off a ministry.